All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we are tracking what is basically a 300-year domino effect. It's a massive chain reaction of exploration, survival, and rebellion that somehow defied all the odds to create the United States.
I mean, really think about it for a second. How exactly did 13 divided, totally undersupplied colonies actually manage to defeat the world's undisputed superpower? On paper, it's impossible. No way. But to figure out how it happened, we've got to hit rewind. We need to look at the continent long before European ships ever even crossed the Atlantic.
So let's jump right into part 1, First Peoples and Arrivals, focusing on the era before 1492.
You know, long before those ships arrived, North America wasn't empty. Not at all. It was home to millions of people, organized into hundreds of highly complex societies. Down in the Southwest, you had the ancestral Pueblo engineering these absolutely incredible cliffside stone villages. Over along the Mississippi, the city of Cahokia featured these massive, towering earthen mounds. Get this, at its peak, Cahokia was actually larger than London. And up in the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee formed a really sophisticated political alliance, one that would actually go on to influence American democratic ideals later down the line.
But then 1492 hits, and everything shifts. When Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the Caribbean while searching for Asia, well, he unwittingly fired the starting gun on a relentless era of global exploration. Before you knew it, France, the Netherlands, and England were all racing across the Atlantic.
Now, these European powers had vastly different motives. Spain, they were mainly driven by a quest for gold and rapidly conquering vast empires in Central and South America. England, though, was playing a different game entirely. They were focused on planting roots, establishing permanent communities. They were chasing economic opportunity and, for a lot of them, a desperate search for religious freedom.
Which brings us nicely to our second section, building the 13 colonies.
And let me tell you, getting these communities off the ground was a brutal fight for survival. Take Jamestown in 1607. You had inexperienced settlers getting completely decimated by disease and freezing winters during what they called the starving time. They literally only survived by pivoting to tobacco, which was a wildly addictive and super profitable crop back in Europe. 13 years later, the Plymouth Pilgrims faced a similarly devastating winter that wiped out half of their people. Their survival rested entirely on the Wampanoag Nation, stepping in and sharing local agricultural techniques. That cooperation, by the way, is what eventually inspired Thanksgiving.
But there's a really dark side to this rapid growth. Survival and profitability in these colonies required massive amounts of agricultural labor. As Virginia's tobacco plantations expanded, the demand for workers skyrocketed. At first, they relied on indentured servants from Europe, but plantation owners increasingly turned to enslaved labor. So, in 1619, the first documented Africans arrived in Virginia. It's a tragic, absolute turning point, initiating a system of racial slavery that would deeply shape American history for centuries to come.
Fast forward to the early 18th century, and you've got over 2 million people populating this thriving, really diverse ecosystem of 13 British colonies. And they developed highly distinct regional identities, too. New England leveraged its rocky coast to build a massive fishing and shipbuilding economy. The middle colonies, they produced so much wheat they basically became America's breadbasket. This area included tolerant Pennsylvania, formerly Dutch New York, and Maryland, which was a Catholic refuge. Meanwhile, the southern colonies built an economy completely dependent on vast plantations and enslaved labor to mass-produce tobacco and rice. All of this combined fueled incredibly busy, wealthy port cities.
So, the colonies are booming. That leads us right into Section 3, the spark of revolution.
This rapid expansion just couldn't continue unchecked. It inevitably collided with French and Native American territories, which sparked the French and Indian War in 1754. Fun fact, this actually gave a young George Washington his very first military experience. Britain ultimately won in 1763, expelled France, and became the undisputed dominant power in North America. But that victory came with an enormous financial cost. And that raised the ultimate million-dollar question: who is going to pay for the empire's massive debt? Britain's answer? The American colonies should foot the bill through direct taxation. And man, did that trigger a rapid domino effect of escalation. First up, the 1765 Stamp Act taxes printed materials, sparking the famous furious battle cry, "No taxation without representation." The tension just keeps building until it boils over in 1770. Nervous British soldiers fire into a crowd, killing 5 civilians in what becomes known as the Boston Massacre. By 1773, you've got disguised colonists literally dumping hundreds of chests of British tea into the harbor, the Boston Tea Party. Britain retaliates hard with the Intolerable Acts, placing Massachusetts under harsh, punishing military control.
Which pushes everyone to the brink in Section 4, the fight for independence.
If Britain thought harsh punishments would isolate Massachusetts, they were dead wrong. It actually united the colonies, leading straight to the First Continental Congress. Then, on April 19, 1775, the powder keg finally explodes. British troops march to seize weapons in Lexington and Concord, but they find colonial militia members, the Minutemen, waiting for them. Shots ring out. In the fierce violence that follows, hundreds of British soldiers fall. The Revolutionary War had officially begun, prompting the Second Continental Congress to name George Washington commander of a, let's be honest here, severely undersupplied volunteer army. While Washington is out there trying to keep his struggling army alive, Thomas Paine publishes a pamphlet called Common Sense, and it spreads like wildfire. It totally fuels the public's desire to just break away from Britain completely. This momentum peaks on July 14, 1776, with the Declaration of Independence. Primarily penned by Thomas Jefferson, it boldly announces that the colonies are now free and independent states. It asserts this explosive, radical idea for the time, that all people possess fundamental rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Now, we do have to pause and be real here for a second. There is a stark contrast between those soaring words and the reality on the ground. These philosophical ideals of liberty and equality absolutely did not immediately apply equally to everyone living in America, especially not to enslaved Africans and Native Americans. Yet, by officially writing them down, these principles were set in stone as the ultimate foundational goal of the entire American experiment.
But hey, just declaring independence doesn't automatically win you a war. By late 1776, Washington's army is taking brutal hits. Morale is literally collapsing. A lot of people thought the revolution was totally doomed. But then, on Christmas night, Washington makes this desperate, wild gamble. He leads his men across the icy Delaware River in the middle of a winter storm for a surprise attack at Trenton. It works. It keeps the revolution alive just long enough to hit 1777, and the massive turning point at Saratoga, where American forces somehow managed to capture an entire British army. Saratoga was the ultimate proof of concept. It proved to the entire world that America actually had a fighting chance. This massive victory convinces France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic to jump into the fray. So, what started as a localized colonial rebellion instantly transforms into a global conflict. This gave the Americans the crucial money, weapons, soldiers, and naval power they desperately needed. Britain wasn't just fighting colonists anymore, they were fighting a world war. And that brings us to the final chapter, Section 5, Birth of a Nation. In 1781, the decisive trap is finally sprung at Yorktown, Virginia. George Washington, alongside French forces under General Rochambeau, surrounds the British by land, while a massive French fleet blocks any escape by sea. It was an absolute checkmate. Completely outmaneuvered and relentlessly bombarded, British General Cornwallis is forced to surrender. The major fighting was over. And by 1783, the Treaty of Paris made it all official. Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. A new nation was born. But it leaves us with this fascinating, lingering question. The war was over, but how do you actually build a country from scratch? Winning independence was an incredible, almost impossible feat, but uniting 13 fiercely independent, very different states under one government, one economy, and one constitution, that was a completely different battlefield. The revolution had ended, sure, but the true challenge of the United States had literally only just begun. All right, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.